Hello, and welcome to Industry Talks with Forteck.
Today we have Lochlan Munro on. Lochlan, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm a Forest Tech. I graduated from the Selkirk program down in Castlegar, British Columbia. I currently work in the Kootenay region, based out of Cranbrook. Spent a lot of time timber cruising, but also do different layout and stand management prescriptions and stuff like that.
Right on. So today the topic that we were going to talk on was the difference between forestry in Alberta and British Columbia. So I guess you've spent one shift working for us in the past up in, I think you're near Fort Mac or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, we were from Wandering River pretty much up to Conklin doing TFPs.
Yeah, great on. And majority of my background is in Alberta, and I would say majority of yours would be, your field experience would be in BC. So we can have a good chat here about some of the differences. I think one of the main differences is the way that the timber is allocated, I guess. In Alberta, it's all FMAs for the most part, and then there's PTPs. But BCTS controls a large majority of the timber in BC. Do you want to maybe touch on?
Timber sales, I don't think I wouldn't say they own a majority. I think industry really does still have the zone on it. Like, it does make a little bit of more of an interesting thing, and it affects how we pay stumpage to the Crown based off market value pricing is a lot of its main objective. But it does make it a little bit different when you enter buying timber sales and making contractors kind of can do their own thing. I think we also have a little bit more private logging within British Columbia, which is different because they also follow a different set of guidelines compared to what we do working on Crown land. But timber, like BC Timber Sales has about the same equivalent as same TSA, which is like your guys who use forest management areas. We have a couple different licenses within BC that goes to the Crown. Like you have your timber supply area, which would be an area-based volume that you're allowed to take. And then there's tree farm licenses, community forest licenses, as well as tree farms, which tree farms and woodlot owners is a bit more of a small scale, and it's an area-based compared to volume-based for your the amount you're allowed to take per 5 years.
Some of the biggest practices that I've noticed are differences around stream classifications. So in Alberta, we have intermittents. I guess ephemeral would be the smallest, and then intermittent. Some companies operate with transitionals, and then small permanent and large permanents, and then obviously lakes and beaver ponds. Primarily for the streams, they're classified in Alberta 100% based on channel width, and that's it. You want to maybe just touch on stream classifications in BC and how it would differ from in Alberta?
The biggest difference that goes towards that is just the fish bearing aspect of it. I think we have a lot more aspect and more restrictions if any stream is fish bearing. But it also does have classifications to do with kind of like the width as well as the steepness of it, and that all goes back to fish bearing as well. Like as soon as a stream goes over 20%, then it's pretty much, you're going to say it's a non-fish bearing stream, and you can classify that as a fish break, and then it gets a lower buffer.
What size buffers would you see on creeks? Like ephemeral, we just center line for the most part. Sometimes you're not even required to, depending on the operating ground rules. And then an intermittent is center line typically, or flagged on both sides. And then transitional would be typically a 10-meter buffer, and a small permanent would be a 30-meter buffer, and large permanent would be typically a 60-meter buffer. But like a small perm is like say a 1-meter channel, and transitional 0.4 to 0.7 of a meter. So I guess what would be equivalent to that, and what size of buffer would you typically see on something like that? And ours are hard buffers. Like,
yeah, so we have different treatments you can use for the different sizes. Like an NCD, which we call a non-classified drainage, is very similar to what you guys would call an ephemeral. And same thing, it may not get no management depending on the area, or it may just get centerline, so you don't have skidders crossing it as much. Same thing with even if you go down to a small S6, it may just have a management zone. So you may have a machine-free zone in there, but you're still allowed to take trees out. You just have to keep a certain amount of basal area or retention within that area. And then as soon as you get up to like more of the fish-bearing streams, you have, which is an S4 and higher, you normally have a hard buffer on them of 10 to 20 meters. And right up to like 100-meter buffer on some of the big streams.
how regulated is that hard buffer? Like, is it 10 meters, give or take, or does it have to be 100% of the time more than 10 meters? Say if it was a 10 meter.
Yeah, it's definitely, you definitely have to follow the rules.
Yeah.
Luckily with the new technology, it's pretty easy to out in the field draw a map draw a line and follow your line. But I mean, you've got to pull the old string box out if you need to.
Yeah, because in like in Alberta, the government will specifically come out and like look for string and measure, and if they find some areas where you're like a meter or too short, depending on the forest officer, they'll start setting out fines and stuff for that. Is that something that you've seen or heard of?
Yeah, exact same thing as in like we would call it in BC trespass. So, you have your area you're allowed to take, and as soon as you cross a hard boundary like that, it's considered a trespass. And whether it's the contractor that gets in trouble or the forest licensee, same thing. Our forest officers can make those type of calls and fines. The other thing that's a little bit interesting in Alberta, I find, depending on which licensee you're working for, they may put more boundaries and buffers on than the government actually requires. I know Canfor, for the most part, is really good about water management, and they'll overclassify streams and do more protections just because their biologist has said that they believe that it needs more management than even the government requires. Same thing with bird habitat or bear's den. Certain licensees will manage things differently. And like we have management plans that come down from the top government, which is like part of FERPA, which is we call it the Forest Range and Practices Act. And then we have higher level planning, which like in certain regions, they have better classifications for different things that they find values that are more important. On the coast, streams obviously get a bit more of a buffer and a bit more attention just because salmon's such a big thing when you go out west. We don't really have salmon in this part of British Columbia, so it's just protecting trout streams primarily. But like licensees will overprotect than what even the government asks at times.
Great. Let's talk timber cruising. So you do quite a bit of timber cruising, right? Mm-hmm. You want to just touch on maybe the legislation around timber cruising? Because in Alberta, it's not required. So we don't really do any timber cruising. Sometimes like mills will do a modified cruise just to get volume, or they'll do prison plots or something just to get estimated volume of their stands in more detail, more so for the financial and purposes and to let the loggers know how much volume they'll be bringing in, and then everything else is just scaled in the yard, and that's how it works. So you want to just maybe touch on the legislation around timber cruising in BC and like how much, like, does everywhere need timber cruised, and is there any exceptions to not needing timber cruise, and maybe just touch on timber cruising?
Yeah, so anything coming off Crown land must be timber cruised, and that all has to do with the appraisal process that British Columbia requires. That equates into what your stumpage is. So I know, I'm not 100% sure how Alberta's stumpage works, but in BC, you're paying a certain amount per every meter cubed you bring into the mill. And depending on the quality of the wood you're taking out, how much you had to access, the road building, steepness of it, you get different breaks for different things for how hard your logging is. So, if you have to heli wood out, you're not paying the same stumpage on that wood as if you just had a roadside block that was half a kilometer off a highway 10 minutes down the road from the mill. That wood's going to cost you a little bit more because it's cheap for you to access. To So timber cruising is part of that appraisal, and it's really like you can get a pretty good estimation of how much volume you have in the wood, as well as looking for different forest health aspects, how scarred up the wood is. If you have beetle infestation in there, you're looking for armful area, which is a root disease in BC, can also be a really big deal. So you got to look out for root disease and different quality calls. But it's really like building an estimation of how much wood's there and how much the wood's worth to help in the appraisal process, which will in the end help out in the stumpage process.
Another couple of topics, just kind of working through the whole process here, but I guess block layout and road layout. Do you guys run deflection lines when you do road layout?
Not deflection lines, would go more towards cable operations.
Right.
So deflection lines are more about whether or not you can, when you're setting up a cable operation, whether or not you're actually going to be able to pull that wood up the hill without just driving it square into the dirt. You also like, we have a lot as well you guys do about soil compaction and how much soil disruption you can do. And obviously if you're just hauling wood straight up a mountain, burying it in the ground the whole time, you're going to tear up all the soils and ruin your top layer as well as your forest floor. So you got to make sure you have proper deflection. That's more of deflection lines. Luckily in this day and age, if you do have LiDAR data, deflection lines can pretty much all be run within 1 meter contour slopes and just put into Skyline XL, which is a cool program. You can like pick the different sizes of what you're going to be using for yarders, or if you're using trees, or if you have a backtail spar, depending on your heights, and you can just build your slope profile and figure out if you'd have deflection or not. Road building, we definitely, in some of the complicated steep slopes, we have to have geoengineers and more engineering process to come in to build some of the roads for sure, depending on how steep your road is, how much rocks in your road, what your substrate is. But I mean, topography here is just so much different. It definitely changes a little bit. Yeah,
like obviously it's a lot flatter in Alberta in most places. There's some exceptions like along the eastern slopes and Swan Hills. But yeah, for the most part, when we're doing roads, it's pre-planned or sometimes you just pre-plan the day before, and you just do what makes sense and kind of go out and just lay it out and just cruise along, and there's not really too much that goes into it unless you're in some steeper ground, obviously. But like, I don't know, when we're doing block layout, our guys are usually getting between say 3 to 7 kilometers a day per guy, and then in roading it would be closer to that, like 3 average or 2.5, something like that, depending on the ground. It could be as low as 2 kilometers a day in some tougher ground roading. What kind of production in like lineal meters or kilometers do you guys typically run into? I'm assuming it's a lot less when you're dealing with slopes and all sorts of stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, you can punch in, if you have like a decent block and you just need it's pretty flat in areas, you can get a couple kilometers reccied in and hung pretty easily. I don't know how much work you guys actually do with clinos, like really figuring out your grades as much as we have to do. Like on a steep slope, if we're trying to put in a road on something greater than 45% and you're on a try and fail aspect, I mean, we've spent a week and a half just recceing roads and just like trying one thing and failing and then trying another thing and failing. And it's like just a giant try and fail process, because especially if you don't have LiDAR and you're running on 20-meter topography maps, all of a sudden there could be a giant piece of rock in the middle of the road you can't see, or a bench you just can't quite make it to, and you're trying to find landings and switchback locations can just be such a make or break situation where if you need to get a couple switches in and you just can't find that relief under like 25-35%, because you really do need to be like under 25 to be able to put a good solid switchback in, it can be tough.
Yeah, no doubt.
It's a defeating thing when you spend a week just hanging around and you never make it anywhere.
Yeah, no, that's
and that's the whole thing why we can't get paid in production, because there's weeks where we spend a whole week doing recce and like never hung a piece of hard ribbon the whole week, because you just try as hard as you try. And some companies are willing to do more things that other companies aren't, right? Like if you got to haul wood adverse, you really don't want to have any type of sustained slope over 10 to 12%, or else it's just too hard on the loggers. It's too hard on their trucks. It doesn't make sense profitability wise. So you really have to balance your distances between road and like skid distancing too. Like how far can you get a road in? Is it worth it to skid the wood a little bit further? But even then, you don't really want to be skidding on steep slopes because they got to build skid trails, same type of thing. You don't want to be skidding more than, 300, 350 meters max.
Yeah. And what kind of like utilization standards, like how much volume per hectare, like meters cube per hectare, things like that would you guys typically be targeting?
I mean, we want to be in that 250 to 350 range, kind of in that's good.
Yeah.
Block I'm cruising right now, I'm running about 150 cubes per hectare in fir, and that's we're in like that's a low block for us. Like,
yeah.
Patchy. Obviously when you move into coastal operations and stuff like that, like they can be running some big numbers, but 1,000 cubes per hectare in a massive coastal forest block. But I mean, for us, anything over 400 is a good volume block.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd say like a lot of our clients in Alberta, their minimum is 50 meters cube per hectare. Like 50. So definitely running some smaller volume stands for sure. But I mean, it's relatively flat. Logging costs are a lot cheaper due to a lot of reasons, like we're not blasting in roads and stuff, right? So definitely they push the volume per hectare a lot here. And up north, some of the stands don't get that big, right? Because they're in cold climates and kind of swampier grounds and stuff like that. So, but
as far as utilization, like, and then 17.5 for spruce or any other merchantable species, like what do you guys use for utilization that way?
It all depends on the client. I'd have to look, but like usually around 10 or some 10 to 12, something like that.
Yeah. That's a small pine tree.
Yeah. Like I said, it varies a lot depending on the client. Some are more willing to go smaller or bigger, and depends if it's deciduous or not too. There's a lot of deciduous operations in Alberta too, depending on where you're at. So.
Which is something like pretty much in any prescription we have, it's going to be retain as much deciduous as you can for the most part. Like we're not going anywhere. It's just going to end up in a slash pile. So
yeah, it really depends where you're located in Alberta. Some places it's not feasible or they don't have mills nearby that take it, but there's definitely quite a few deciduous operators on the land base in Alberta. So some areas have pretty high deciduous utilization.
Yeah, I remember that's what we did. A lot of those TSPs was just big old aspens up north.
But I mean, like I think a lot of stands in Alberta are like 90 to 150 meter cube to hectare stands. So like, I mean, you start getting 300-400, those are pretty like on the big side, right? But
yeah, we did some layout in southern Alberta for the mill based out of Cochrane. I can't draw on a blank here, but down in off the trunk road down by Crow's Nest, we did a decent amount of layout in there, and there's some good wood in that area, but it's much in BC at that point. It's not much different than Fernie. It's got nice spruce and pine.
Yeah.
Spray Lakes. There you go.
Great on. Well, that was a good chat that we had. I'm trying to think of other topics that maybe we could touch on briefly, but we went over pretty much a lot of different things. We didn't touch on like harvesting and ops too much, but I don't have any significant experience with per se actual logging equipment. But I can imagine the constraints when you're dealing with the steep slopes or starting to get into like cable ground and stuff like that.
Well, I think cable's kind of a little bit of in the interior, it's not quite used as much unless you're like around Golden and Revelstoke where it is really steep and coastal. You're still seeing some cable operations. The big change and stuff these days is the winch assist. So pretty much you push a cat up to the top of a road, find a bench that you can perch it on, hook a buncher up to it, and drop it off the slope. And then skidders are kind of past the operation. Skidders just run up and down the roads, or if you have a skid trail pushed in. But you pretty much follow the wood with the buncher attached to a cat at the top, winching it. And then they take a hoe chucker, which is pretty much just a hoe with a grapple on it. And the grapple, it just literally has to shuffle the wood down the mountain. So it's a slow process, but that's the restraints of what it is. Lots of it's because you can't get deflection to do cable logging, which is kind of changed it a little bit with the winch assist. You can get into these areas that previously they really had no way of accessing. It was too steep to take out any other way, and you couldn't get deflection. So they're accessing some wood that historically they haven't been able to before. And it's just a little bit more profitable and quicker than actually cable. You don't have, and safer, right? Because you don't have hand fallers. I mean, logging's still the most dangerous profession in Canada just because of coastal falling, right? Like even in this day and age, we still see a couple deaths a year from hand fallers on the coast, whether it be trees falling on them accidentally or springboarding or whatever it is. It's still it's the wild, wild west out there a little bit still, and they're still falling big wood, and it's a dangerous career. So the more we can have guys not underneath trees on chainsaws, it's probably a little bit better.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Well, appreciate your time tonight, and yeah, it's good to always kind of discuss province to province. And as you know, we work in Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan. We didn't touch on Saskatchewan today, but yeah, so it's good to chat on province legislation differences. And a lot of times I find it's the legislation that makes things a lot different, but then it's also the landscape and topography would be the next thing as well, right?
Yeah, topography. I mean, the species too. Like we have over 7 commercial species in British Columbia and that's just like coniferous. So that changes the ball game a little bit too when you're targeting the different things you can do with cedar, the different pricing of what. I mean, cedar is just so much more valuable.
Yeah, pretty much we're spruce and pine, and then deciduous. So
yeah, it's
and fir, I guess. We'll take fir as well.
Yeah, I mean, we have 3 species of fir we go after here, so some of it's good, some of it's not. I mean, balsam compared to Douglas fir is definitely different, and then grand fir as well. And then the true firs on the coast, like amabilis and such.
Great on. Well, yeah, appreciate your time tonight, and we'll conclude this industry talk with Forteck.
All right, thanks a lot, boys. Thanks for having me.